Thanks very much indeed, Ursula. I'm very conscious of standing between you and the coffee break, so I'll try to be as concise as possible. The best functioning definition of economics is the question, who gets what? And the best functioning definition of politics is the question, who gets what? Politics and economics are both about the struggle through power for the allocation of finite resources. And in that sense, politics is inevitably economic, and economics is inevitably political. I think it's worth, that's obviously a truism, and I'm sure there's nobody here who would fundamentally disagree with that. But what I want to do over the next 20 minutes or so is to try to make this concrete in terms of what's happened in Ireland over the last 15 years. And in terms of trying to understand this particular relationship, and my argument would be that politics is vastly more central to the creation of the current Irish crisis than is dreamed of in the philosophy of orthodox economics. I think if we step back a little bit and we look at the emergence of the Celtic Tiger phenomenon, I'm not going to attempt to give you a long and detailed account of how the Celtic Tiger emerged. But I think it is very important to draw attention to the idea that the way in which the Celtic Tiger was understood, the way in which it was interpreted, had a huge bearing on the way in which it unfolded. After the very early years of the boom, there's no clear distinction between the ideological construction of the boom and the course the boom itself takes. And to put this briefly, what I would suggest is that on any serious objective analysis, the economic transformation of Ireland in the mid to late 1990s was a complex phenomenon, which was the result of the interaction of a whole set of forces, one of which undoubtedly was hypercharged global capitalism. The long American boom of the 1990s generated vast amounts of surplus money for investment. And of course, Ireland happened to be placed to take advantage of a large amount of that investment. But the ways in which it was placed to take advantage of that investment were to do with phenomena which have absolutely nothing fundamental to do with global economic capitalism. And in fact had to do with as I said, a very large range of forces, many of which were completely anathema to orthodox free market thinking. Social partnership, for example. The European Union investment in Ireland in the late 1980s and early 1990s was crucial in maintaining some possibility of an infrastructure which was capable of taking the investment which was arriving in the 1990s. Feminism, for example, which is certainly not one of the favorite concepts of right-wing orthodoxy, had a huge impact. The changes in family structure, the capacity of women to begin to play their part in the workforce, the shift in Ireland from a completely distorted gender pattern in terms of the workforce. Ireland was so fundamentally untypical of Western European societies and began to shift over the course of the 1990s to a more typical pattern. Those kinds of forces clearly were very large aspects of the creation of the Irish boom. And again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know in this. But what's worth remembering is the very quick construction of a notion of the boom which denied the presence of all of these forces. So the boom was quickly understood as a model. It was understood as the Irish model, to the extent that we ended up with the wonderful comedy of Bertie Ahern in Tegucigalpa earlier this year, still giving lectures on how everybody should follow the Irish model at the same time as the Irish model was slipping off the catwalk, shall we say. And that sort of grotesque creation of the idea of the boom, an interpretation of what had happened, which was typical in a way of the construction of ideologies. You know, there was nothing unusual about this, and anybody who's read Gramsci knows how this works. But was fascinating in the sense that it was a very powerful ideology, in that the political system itself began to believe its own propaganda. It began to believe that what had happened in Ireland was the discovery of a universal formula. And that universal formula was essentially the application of global free market orthodoxy. Low taxes, light regulation, pro-business policies, and the subordination of all social goals to the kinds of notions of endless economic growth that John has been talking so eloquently about. Now, the construction of this ideology was particularly toxic because it was reinforced by a very strong international desire to see Ireland in precisely those terms. So this wasn't just about the self-delusion of our own rulers, it was also about the ways in which the distorting mirrors of international opinion reflected back onto Ireland and onto the Irish orthodoxy this idea that, yes, indeed, we had discovered the missing link for development. And that all that needed to happen was that everybody around the world needed to look at the Irish model and to follow it. And a lot of people made very good livings over the course of the Celtic Tiger years in traveling the world, telling people how superb the Irish model was and how it was a universal formula. And if you look time and again, if you look at the speeches that Bertie Ahern was giving, or you look at the reception of this model of the Celtic Tiger around the world, this idea of universality is crucial to it. It was basically saying society doesn't matter, culture doesn't matter, history doesn't matter. There is a formula. If you apply it willy-nilly, you will grow like Ireland. So everybody can become Ireland simply by following this particular strategy. Now, this was particularly deadly in an Irish context where self-delusion was already at epidemic proportions. If you're in a situation in which there's a fundamental arrogance, there's a fundamental swagger, and you get everybody around the world telling you how wonderful you are, you're probably heading towards a psychotic state of megalomania and narcissism. And this effectively is what happened to us, I think. Now, this construction of ideology had really quite profound consequences politically. And one of those consequences politically was an inability to construct an Irish reality. There was an inability to say, first of all, how did we get where we are? But secondly, to understand the boom as part of a process and as a specific opportunity in time which needed to be taken advantage of in order to transform Irish society. It was instead understood as an end in itself, as a point of arrival rather than as a point of departure. And what happened, I would suggest, is that some of the key underlying factors in Irish politics and Irish culture remained entirely untouched. It's an extraordinary historical example of a huge economic transformation which produces no political transformation, and very little in the way of a cultural transformation in the broader sense of changing attitudes. I'm not sure that there are many parallel examples of this elsewhere. But effectively what happened is you had a kind of a turbocharged boom on top of what I want to suggest was essentially a 19th century political and cultural infrastructure. And that this fact in itself had dire economic consequences. that you can't disentangle these political failures from the long-term economic consequences. What I would suggest those 19th century factors were are really 5 factors. And what I want to suggest, and we don't really have time to go into this, but so you'll have to accept my grand thesis in a short form, is that what you had in Ireland was an uncompleted project of political modernity. There's a sense in which Ireland went, and this is an incredibly crude caricature, but went from being pre-modern to being postmodern with nothing in between. We went from certainly an uncompleted political modernity in terms of the construction of a national democracy. We didn't get it. Without the ideas of human rights, for example, without the ideas of a moral community, all of those notions that had to be constructed by other Western European societies as a result of the disasters of the Second World War, the welfare state, ideas of social responsibility, ideas of rooting democracy in society. Those things didn't happen to us because we were outside of the frame of the 1950s reconstruction of Europe. So we had an uncompleted project of modernity. And as a result, there were factors within Irish political culture and Irish social culture which remained rooted in the 19th century and remained unreconstructed. And these, I would suggest, had really profound economic consequences. They're not just factors that we can think about in terms of the hinterland of economics. They fundamentally affected the way the economic story unfolded. And I want to suggest briefly that there are 5 factors. One is, and it's very, very obvious, but maybe so obvious we don't state it often enough, one is the obsession with land as the primary source of wealth. There is a sense in which you got hypercharged global free market capitalism coming on top of feudalism. And we actually recreated a kind of feudalism in Ireland over the boom years. It's an extraordinary paradox. And we recreated that feudalism by creating a land-owning and land-controlling class which was able to determine the shape of the economy. Fundamentally, the grotesque nature of the property boom in Ireland was determined by the vast overpricing of land, which was built into house prices, which was built into all the infrastructural projects, which was built into the use of vast amounts of the resources which were liberated by the economic boom. And that in turn was to do with a cultural obsession with property ownership and with land itself as being the only secure basis for wealth. It's an extraordinary thing to happen. When you get wealth going on around you, being created by Intel, being created by Viagra, being created by, post-industrial global capitalism in its most stark form, you expect that to have an effect in terms of the way people think about wealth. It did not. Weirdly, we still thought about wealth in terms of the ownership of land, the control of land, and in many ways the corrupt exploitation of land, for example, through the corrupt buying of the development of the capital city through the direct paying off of councillors for a huge period, which shaped the development of Ireland. And in terms of John's brilliant exposition of the environmental costs of this, I mean, this physically shapes the space in which we lived. The figure which is often used, but is still so stark that it's hard to believe, but it is true, is the growth of Greater Dublin to the size of Los Angeles, with a quarter of the population of Los Angeles. The fundamental disruption of physical space, which is also a disruption of political space. The idea of community, the idea of understanding yourself as being connected, was fundamentally disrupted. So that was the first, I would say, 19th century factor. The second 19th century factor was Tammany Hall. We continued with a political system which was utterly rooted in Irish 19th century politics. Irish 19th century politics have actually very little to do with Ireland. In the first half of the 19th century, they're to do with the extraordinary creation of the world's first democratic political machine, which is Daniel O'Connell's Catholic Association. But its manifestation then because of the famine and mass emigration, is in the building of the Democratic Party machines in the urban centres of Eastern America. And that machine politics is completely characterized by its continuation in Ireland. Essentially, the two major political parties in Ireland are Tammany Hall and sort of Tammany Annex. They're a big, successful Democratic Party urban machine and a less successful Democratic Party urban machine, which operate entirely on 19th century systems of clientelism and patronage. Patronage is the absolute key, and within that system of patronage, then there's an assumption of the kinds of economic orthodoxies that John has spoken about. But the complete continuation of those systems of patronage. The third 19th century factor I would suggest arises out of that, which is a false intimacy, an understanding of the state as being personal rather than impersonal. And again, you don't need me to go into great detail about this, but the understanding of the way in which the state operated and should operate was still deeply rooted in a 19th century idea of politics as an elite formation in which personal connection matters much more than any abstract notion of rights or entitlement. So you get the Galway tent. So you get all the consequences of the Galway tent, which is this intense connection between those in power and those who stand to benefit from the use of political power. And one of the things that this really, I would suggest, has two consequences. One of them is crony capitalism. The intensely interconnected board structures, for example, in Irish public companies and banks. The way in which you simply couldn't attend, if you were a member of any board of consequence in Ireland, any meeting at which there were not people who were also members of your own board. That sort of intense localism, intimacy, and cronyism, which had profound economic consequences. But the second aspect of this, which I think in some ways is even more profound, is the culture of impunity. One of the things I think is sometimes misunderstood about Ireland and its political culture is that Ireland is not necessarily more corrupt than many other Western societies. I don't think it's more corrupt than Chicago politics, for example, or more corrupt certainly than Italy. The difference, and the thing we don't really often focus on in Ireland, is impunity. There's an understanding in most societies that if you get caught, you have to be made an example of, because the illusion, at least, of ethical standards has to be maintained. You do the perp walk in the States if you get caught. The extraordinary force in Irish public life is absolute impunity. And absolute impunity, is worth saying, was enhanced by the tribunals. The tribunal process did not ultimately lead to a diminution of corruption in Ireland. It led to the absolute understanding that it didn't matter if you got caught. I believed, and I think many people believe, that if only people knew about the levels of corruption in Irish politics and business, that it would change fundamentally. It did not change, and we put ourselves into the no man's land, which is knowledge but no consequence, which is actually worse than no knowledge and no consequence, because it creates a sense among this elite that there is absolute impunity. There is nothing you won't get away with if you are properly connected. And this has huge consequences, and huge consequences in terms of the culture of greed, of recklessness, but also the complete failure of regulation in the economy as a whole, and particularly, obviously, in banking. The failure of regulation cannot be divorced from the politics of corruption. The politics of corruption being the way in which the specific nature of Irish corruption, which was not necessarily a transactional kind of corruption. which is, I give you €100,000 and you do X. That sometimes happens, but mostly doesn't. It's much worse than that, which is a sort of permeation of the entire system by the idea that there are people who are untouchable. And if you're in the business of regulation, you better overcompensate to make sure that you don't step on certain toes. This is very simple. I mean, this isn't some sort of abstract magic. I mean, the central bank, for example, which is a key force in the collapse of the Irish economy. The central bank knows institutionally, I mean, the people who are running the central bank or running regulation, for example, were directly dealing with the Ansbacher accounts, for example, in the 1980s. They were directly dealing with, they uncovered the fact that there was a vast criminal conspiracy to evade taxes, to commit fraud, to evade the foreign exchange laws. And they knew, first of all, that one of the members of their own board, Ken O'Reilly Highland, was part of this conspiracy. And they knew that it was being run by Des Traynor, who was Charlie Haughey's bagman. And they knew that Charlie Haughey himself was part of this. Now, how do you function as regulators in that kind of circumstance? You develop a defensive strategy where you choose not to know certain things, where knowledge becomes completely impotent. And that culture of regulation carried over completely into the boom years. We developed what I like to call the traffic light system of Irish regulation, which was like the Irish flag. It was orange for, oh shit, what's going on here? White for, oh dear, my mind has gone blank. And green for, ah, well, go ahead. And that system had profound economic consequences. You know, it actually created the possibility of the extraordinary recklessness of the Irish banking system. And let's remember, you're dealing with people who already feel untouchable. You know, constitutionally and culturally, the property developers, the bankers, are developing over this period, partly because of the Celtic Tiger ideology, a sense that they are masters of the universe. And if you feed into that then, this absolute sense of being connected and of therefore being untouchable, you get a particularly toxic kind of combination. So you have those 19th century factors that continue to operate in terms of the way the political system functions. And in that context, you get a complete failure to tackle what is probably the last of the big 19th century forces, which is one of the extraordinary aspects of the political and cultural context in which the boom unfolded is the extraordinary failure to come to terms with technology. I mean, it is quite staggering when you look back on it and you think, here is a boom which is fundamentally led by world-leading IT innovation, the world-leading transnational corporations doing this stuff are here. We all understand that this is crucial to the nature of the boom, and you get a political culture and a social culture which are completely oblivious to this fact and completely incapable of dealing with it. So you get, at the level of government, for example, you get some of the most extraordinary bullshit that's been generated in the history of man. You look at any of the statements that come out about IT strategy, they're full of the kind of nonsense which tells you these people just don't know what they're talking about. They really don't understand it at all. They learn a bit of lingo and they just trot it out. And so as a result, you get every single IT project which is put forward by the state is a complete disaster. Every single one of them. You can't point to a single state-led IT project over the entire course of the boom which A, functions, and B, costs anything at all vaguely comparable to what it's projected to cost. And so they fail again and again and again, and you can look at everything from the P-Powers project to the digital hub in Dublin. But more profoundly, this is also connected to the social culture, which doesn't change. And again, this is why I suggest it's 19th century. 19th century ambitions remain key to the economic aspirations of the Irish bourgeoisie. And those 19th century ambitions are, I want my son and daughter to be a doctor or a lawyer. I don't want them to be a mathematician or a scientist. It just doesn't apply. And this isn't, again, theoretical. Anybody ask anybody in DCU, how many points did it take at the height of the boom to get into a mathematics course, and how many points did it take to get into a legal course? You don't need to be a mathematician to calculate the underlying value system that still operates. So, sorry, I'll finish up now in a couple of minutes. But my point is that you have these 19th century factors which continue to operate in terms of the broader political economy of Ireland, and which ultimately contribute directly to the absolute failure of regulation, to the grotesque nature of the property boom, to the unreconstructed nature of the political system, which is incapable of understanding or representing, never mind dealing with the complex economic situation which is arising, and to a political and social culture which is actually incapable of engaging with its own ambitions to be a world-leading IT country. One of the very few ambitions we actually articulated as a society was that we were going to be in the top 10 OECD countries in terms of broadband, for example. We're somewhere around number 30 after everything. Now, the implications of this, and this is really where I want to come to a conclusion, the implications of this seem to me to be quite profound. And what they suggest to me is that by and large, we can look at the collapse of the Irish economy as a sort of Freudian return of the repressed. That the unreconstructed, unprocessed 19th century forces that are still implicit in the political culture ultimately work their way through and express themselves in an incapacity to create a sustainable economic prosperity. The narrowness of the idea of what an economy is, of what the ambitions of that economy are, makes it impossible to create a sustainable economics and a sustainable society. The poverty of ambition over all those years is absolutely extraordinary. That with huge budget surpluses, with immense social confidence, with an optimism that hadn't been in the society for probably 200 years or more, the complete failure to set even modest social goals and reach them is absolutely extraordinary. And if you look simply at, for example, look at the 2002 Fianna Fáil manifesto, the 2007 Fianna Fáil manifesto. The 2002 Fianna Fáil manifesto says we will obliterate consistent poverty over the course of the government by 2007. The 2007 manifesto says we will attempt to reduce consistent poverty. After 10 years in government, you get an actual reduction of one of the relatively modest social ambitions which has been created and which has of course failed. So my conclusion from all of this is that if all of this is true, then what we're facing is not just a set of narrowly defined economic problems. It is a larger task of essentially completing the project of democratic modernity in Ireland. Without a political revolution, which fundamentally alters the nature of the political system and the political culture that surrounds it, economic transformation, it seems to me, is impossible. So long as we have a completely unreconstructed system, which has no sense of public values, which has no sense of public space, which has no sense of an idea of long-term goals, and which continues to have a sense of impunity. I mean, look at John O'Donoghue, for example. I mean, listen during the week to the vox pops about the poor man and how he was being scapegoated. So long as that political culture remains, I would suggest economic transformation will be fundamentally impossible. And therefore, I would suggest that the task for progressive thinking is to, in a very profound way, begin the task of uniting politics with economics, of making the argument as to why political change is crucial to economic survival. If they get away with the current project, which is to batten down the hatches and attempt to get out of the boom somehow through global economic growth without any political change, then I would suggest that the length of the Irish Depression will break all records. If there is not a sense that this moment can be taken to recreate or to create for the first time perhaps an alternative political project, then economic change will not happen. Thank you very much.